Hi, we're just going to have a look at another potential project, and this is the foreign version of the BMC Threepenny Bit lorry, which is this beastie. Now, just unpack this for the first time. This is a model 1:43, 7mm scale. Looks to be quite a nice model, not a crude job. As I say, it's a foreign version. Sava is the badge on the front, as opposed to BMC. It's left-hand drive, and of course we want right-hand drive. The only other difference that I can see with the bodywork between this and the British version is these two pairs of bottom grills don't exist on the British version. On the British version it only has those grills. That's the only significant difference I can ascertain. Of course the mirror's configured for left-hand drive as well. It's actually a tipper model. I don't know if I'll bother with that, but of course it's a very nice prototype, very interesting prototype, and certainly very typical of my youth. So it'd be nice to do something with it. This is actually the second one I've bought, which I've just unwrapped. And I've already started having a play with the first one. Now, like all these things, it comes with moulded detail, like the differential on the back axle and various other chassis details, some of which are going to have to go if we're going to motorise this thing. Interestingly, this version has a typically continental front axle with independent suspension, as opposed to the more typical British beam axle. Now, a beam axle is what we are going to want for our suspension. So there will be a few adaptations along the way. So that's absolutely what we're starting with. Nice little model. So first things first, sorry about that, a strip down. The model comes apart with the usual fairly horrible triangular screws. Don't even know why they use those, but they do. There we go. So we can't do what we want to do. The third screw, or the last screw, you have to unclip the spare wheel underneath. It just pops off, and underneath you'll find the last fixing screw for the tipper body. We then are left with being able to split cab, body, etc. from the chassis. Now then, that's the cab of the thing. I've already taken some 2000 grit wet and dry, and taken the foreign lettering off the cab sides, so that's anglicised. It would be possible to respray this by drilling out the rivets holding all the glazing to release the glazing, but then of course you've also got to carefully pop out all the lights, mirrors and all the rest, or otherwise mask them. The knee lights here, they aren't riveted in. They would have to pop out and glue back in quite carefully. So you need to be sure of what you're doing before you strip the glazing out to respray. But it would look awfully nice in a green or maroon, I would have thought, but there we go. So later on it'll need a new mirror fitting on the other side. This one's a bit crude anyway, so that one's fine. The internal detail is what it needs changing for right-hand drive. Now this I've already done. It's remarkably simple. It just needed the steering column snipping off at the base with side cutters. I'm leaving the pedals where they are, but that's where the steering column was. And then the whole thing of the steering column and instrument pod is instantly released. In order to relocate it, I just found some tube that sleeved over the steering column and then epoxied that tube. Well, I then drilled a hole in the correct place in the floor and then epoxied the tube in to carry the steering column, because of course I'd shortened the steering column by snipping it, and that gives a nice robust fixing, and it's instantly right-hand drive, which is very nice. So when you pop that detail back in the cab, there we have a right-hand drive. Whoops. There we have a nice right-hand drive cab. Let me just fetch this left-hand drive one against the left-hand drive cab. So you can see how absolutely easy that was. You'll also notice I've taken off the paint, I was going to say off the buffer beam, you know what I mean, off the bumper. I'll probably repaint that a chrome colour much later on. So making it right-hand drive was dead easy, far easier than I thought it was going to be. So that's nice. The chassis. I've already started chopping it about. Here we have the chassis chopped about. Now, of course, here we had the cast differential and a prop shaft, and all I've done so far is first of all I did a deep chop through the centre of the diff, and that chopped the axle in half to release both back wheels, and having released both back wheels and generated a bit of heat in the process, I was able to work the old axles out of the wheels, because I always put new axles in to fit the bevel gears. And similarly I used a little circular saw, diamond saw, in the mini drill and chopped the axle out to give me space there for gears, and also chopped the prop shaft and prop shaft support out there, and that'll house the motor. Now, previous video I've talked about the lovely K20s, which I absolutely adore. I found out today that the K20 doesn't seem to be available at the moment. Whether it will be in the future remains to be seen, but certainly as we speak it's not available. So this one I'm going to fit with these little 10mm gear motors, planetary gear motors, and I've already fitted them with the black nylon bevel gears. Now the bevel gears start life like that, and they need boring out, in this instance to about 3.8mm, and then after they've bored out, cutting off back there just behind the gear part, and then fixing them on with Devcom on there, and that'll be a really nice solid fixing. These particular motors, if I recall, are about 140 RPM at 5 volts, which is a little bit faster than I like, but we'll see. If I don't like it, I can always just take it out and put one of my precious K20s in, or put any other sort of motor in. That's the joy of this sort of thing. It's no big deal really to change the motors. These have moulded wings in. Those I shall just snip off simply for convenience. So that's the motor that I'm anticipating using, and that will, whoops, very simply go somewhere in there, and I shall of course locate that after the axle is in place. Plenty of room, no problem there at all. It's certainly quite strong enough, so power isn't an issue. The original axles were rather strange 1.7mm diameter, so I thought I'd put 2mm diameter in to replace it. And interestingly, that 2mm diameter new axle just slides in and is a lovely easy fit in there. Haven't had to bore it out at all, so that's great. That will be the new axle. Gears, a shortened gear will go on there because I've not got too much room on there, and then the rear wheels will go on there, and that'll be the drive done. So that's ever so easy. The front, I've already taken off the independent suspension front axle because I don't want it. I will be cutting a slot in there for a beam axle later on when I've made up a beam axle. I haven't done that yet. The front wheels, that's one of the front wheels, has a very hollow back, which I can't do very much with at the moment, so I need to fill that completely with milliput. And once I've done that and once it's dried, I can then just pop it in the lathe because that's the most convenient for me, and then clean it up and bore it out for my flange bearings, and that'll be opening it out to 5mm. It is possible to do it by hand if you've not got a lathe. I've done it by hand on the mechanical horse, and you can still get an accurate job. But since I've got a lathe, I'm going to use it. So my next job is going to be to fill those up, and then let it harden overnight, and then I shall come back sometime in the morning and bore them out and get that ready for bearings. And I may even have a session making the front axle for that. All in all, it's, whoops, says I'm throwing it on the floor, looks to be a fairly easy conversion, but we'll see. I'm sure something will come up and bite me. Right, so here's some milliput made up, and what we want to do is just work it into the outside of the wheel, as it were, packing it in as best we can, filling that void, doesn't have to be too tidy. Because I should machine any excess away, and if I wasn't able to machine any excess away, I would use a combination of hand drills very carefully, and also flatten the back off with a large file first to square it off, all carefully, of course. So that'll be fine for that. That's going to be one good solid wheel by tomorrow. As I've talked about before, I always use flanged bearings in these front wheels, and the reason is simply convenience. The very first one I did, I hadn't realised you could get these teeny flange bearings. I'm used to flange bearings on big bearings, but I hadn't realised that you could even get such small flange bearings, and so the only ones I found at the time were normal plain ball races, and I bored out the wheel hub for them, but of course had to be very careful to get the bearings in square. Having a flange on them just makes getting them square very, very much easier. So, and that's the second one full, and that'll be lovely and dry in the morning, and I'll come back and just pop that in the lathe and open out the back and countersink the bearing in it. And of course the bearing needs to sit as deep in as possible, because as we've already said, we want the kingpin as far in as possible, so the wheel effectively turns on the spot rather than travelling forwards and backwards as it turns, so as to get the benefit of it all. So that's all we're going to do this evening on this little lot, which is quite sufficient. We have a pile of bits. We always have a pile of bits up here, but it's no biggie to get the hard work done on this. And of course you can see the two, one not started and the other underway. I doubt we're even talking about 2 hours work so far on this. It's a lovely, easy, refreshing one, which makes a very, very pleasant change. Conversely, this little 4mm tipper, it's wiring it as a right flipping fiddle, to put it mildly. But there we go. All good fun. This is just as the last one has got a K20, K20 in. You couldn't use a 10mm in this. But there we go. That's enough for this evening.